So I'll be talking mostly about a question of fat and fatty acids in sustainable diets, which if you paid attention to the previous presentation has sort of been alluded to a little bit already. But first I just wanted to tell you a little bit about myself and what I bring to the table, because I had a slightly unusual career going backwards and forwards between research and implementation. In the last 10 years, I worked at the University of Cambridge for about half of that, where I did some work on food scenarios to 2050, and the two main outcomes of that were, or the two main messages from that work was that the overall food contribution of food to climate change, which is something we heard today and yesterday a lot, as well as to its potential mitigation. And secondly, how important the demand-side interventions were in bringing about that mitigation. This work was published in 2014, so quite a while ago, in Nature Climate Change, and has sort of catapulted me in this discussion. But it also sort of made me want to go more on the implementation side and try and see what actually we can practically do to bring about this demand-side interventions, specifically the food waste prevention and dietary change. So I joined RAB, which is an organization that has done pioneering work in food waste reduction and food waste measurement, and has been sort of given credit to helping a lot the actual reduction in the UK food waste by 25% since 2008. So I was like, okay, these guys seem to know how to do it. There I led a program that was trying to exploit the synergies between food waste reduction and bringing about healthier and sustainable diets, because they both had drivers in common, they both have stakeholders in common. So we tried to do that through a variety of projects that range from designing behavior change interventions and campaigns to working with low-income groups, doing things like, as well as trying to convince supermarkets to track the healthiness and environmental footprint of their total food sales, and reduce pack sizes of products that are unhealthy and have high impact. For example, bacon, which is currently in UK packaged in packs that are so big that a small household cannot possibly consume it without exceeding the daily recommended allowance or wasting some in the open life that it has available. So that was interesting, but I'm now back at research at SLU, sort of splitting my time between SLU and Karolinska Institute. SLU is an agricultural university, Karolinska Institute is a medical university, so that's quite fitting for somebody who's working in healthy and sustainable diets. I work on a variety of different topics. I had a really hard time choosing which one to cover today, as well as all of the other things that I've done in the recent past. But the decision was made to focus on the role of, to talk about fats. And that is quite interesting, because so far the focus of all of us has really been on the protein when it comes to sustainable diets and transition to sustainable diets. The reason for that is, and this includes me, is that I think there's quite common misconceptions when it comes to fats. We think, I certainly thought, that the fats are unhealthy, and that we're all eating too much, and that everyone should eat less, and therefore the solution to sustainable fat production and consumption is to produce and consume less. But actually, when you look at this in detail, it turns out not to be the case. So only some fatty acids are unhealthy, and so particularly the transaturated fatty acids, and the other ones kind of range between being sort of neutral when they compare them to carbohydrates to being very healthy. And in fact, FAO are recommending that we all consume between 20 to 35% of our calories as fats, so that we get adequate supply of energy, fat-soluble vitamins, and essential fatty acids. And some other recommendations actually even go higher, and we have more people that should increase their fat consumption than we have people that should decrease. This is illustrated in this diagram that looks at, kind of tracks this across different regions of the world. So you have Western Europe, Northern America later on, where we do consume enough, which is sort of signified by the blue lines that show this FAO range within which we should be. The black line shows the target for the average so that we can ensure that all of the population falls somewhere between the blue lines. But we see that also there are many regions in the world that don't reach this black line target, let alone the lower limit. One caveat here is that this is based on food balance sheets, which may not include all of the foods that are consumed. For example, bushmeat. There's a really good paper in PNAS last year if you're interested in that. And the third misconception is that livestock products equal protein. And actually, livestock products contribute a lot to fat. About 45% of all our fat is from livestock products, and 40% of protein is from livestock products today. So they contribute more to our fat consumption than they do to protein. The red bars are animal-based fats, and the yellow ones are plant-based fats. And you can also see that if we reduce drastically the animal-based products, quite a few regions, very few regions would reach even the lower limit. And another thing to consider here is that unlike for protein, livestock production is a net source of fats. What I mean here can be illustrated with this nice diagram from this paper. I'll quickly try and explain it. So it shows that how we get from crop production the amount of a nutrient that is produced, but is then we lose some with harvest, at harvest, post-harvest, we use some for non-food uses. And then this is the interesting part. So that much we feed to animals, and the green bar shows how much we get back. So you can see that we feed more protein to animals that's ingrained in the feed than we get out embodied in meat and dairy. And this is the case for protein, and is the case for calories and most other micronutrients, with a few exceptions. And fat is one of those exceptions, where you can see that we actually feed animals less fat than we get out, and this is particularly true for grazing animals. So this has kind of led me to this question is, okay, how can we improve fat supply, particularly in these under-consuming places, while also reducing animal-based fats, which we all agree we need to at least do to a certain extent on sustainability basis? How do we fill this fat gap? And I'm sort of running out of time, but I have actually, this is kind of as far as I got. What I will just briefly say is that there are no simple answers, because each of the major plant-based fat sources also have their own sustainability issues. If we look at what these main fat sources are, and if we look at the plant-based one, soybean oil is actually linked completely with pork and poultry production, because it's a co-product of pork and poultry feeds. So if we decrease those two, the soybean oil will automatically come down as well. So that's not the answer. Palm oil, we know, has a huge problem with deforestation. It may be an answer, but only as so much as we can increase production without further deforestation. Rape oil has a huge dependence on pesticides and fertilizers, so it's like a high input, high output crop. And the recommendation is that you don't grow it more often than every 5 years in a rotation for those reasons, so that you don't get a pest buildup in the soil. So even in the land that's appropriate for rape, you can only grow it at 1/5 of the land at any given time. So it's kind of limited in that respect. And then we have some other options. Nuts were mentioned, but they might also come with problems, such as water need. We might see an increased production of fats from algae and fungi fats from cellulose or cellulose or food waste as feedstock, but those are still sort of open whether we'll get good enough innovation. And one thing I didn't mention, but a lot of the oils are currently used for biofuels. In fact, more than twice as much palm oil as we eat is used for biofuels and other uses. So maybe one solution would be to divert some to food, but then the International Energy Agency says that we should actually triple the current biofuel production, which might be other than oil crops by 2030. So it doesn't seem like there are any easy solutions. My next steps for me is to quantify all the options that are on the table and see that gets us far enough, suggest best strategies. But the summary for today is that fats are not unhealthy and people like eating them, so they will be likely continue to eat them in the future. And that fats, not only proteins, require consideration and research and innovation and investment. Thank you.